Nutrient timing strategies can be quite confusing for a lot of endurance athletes. And to be honest with you, there are so many moving parts. That is why it's so confusing. So what I'd like to do in this first video is just kind of give you a kind of a lowdown, a nutrient timing strategies 101, just so you can start to understand all these moving parts. Okay. So first of all, nutrient timing, what are we talking about? We're talking about what you're putting in your body before, during, and after training sessions or race or competition. Okay. Now, there are windows within these nutrient timing systems. So before training or competition, the window exists, and that window is 30 minutes to 3 hours beforehand. And I'll explain that in a few minutes. During, most of the time, you only need to worry about consuming fluids, electrolytes, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, right? I'll talk about those in a second. If the workout is longer than 60 minutes. Now, there are some what ifs, right? What if I live in a very hot and humid environment? What if I sweat a lot? What if I'm doing a high intensity workout? Those what ifs definitely warrant the opportunity to maybe include some fluids and some electrolytes and maybe a little bit of carbohydrates. But I would say 90% of the time, if you have a workout that's less than an hour, you usually do not need to consume much during that workout. Okay. It's only after an hour. The last one is the after window. So this is a tricky one, and there's a lot of debate going on currently in the sport nutrition research with that. My take on consuming nutrients after a workout, after a training session, is you want to start immediately, at least with fluids and sodium, because you're going, most likely, you're going to be a little bit dehydrated. So you want to replenish your hydration stores as much as possible. Whether you eat or consume calories, carbohydrate, protein, and fat or not, kind of depends on your goals of what you're trying to achieve, but also the workout. And lastly, what you have coming up the next 24 hours. So I'll explain that here in a second. That post-workout window is usually immediately when you finish, all the way up to about 2 to 3 hours later. Okay. So I'll come back to that here in a sec. The what I call the Fab Five, the five nutrients that are most often discussed when it comes to nutrient timing are fluid or water, carbohydrate, protein, fat, and sodium. Now, let me just take those apart a little bit. Fluid is extremely important to consume before, during, and after, right? But not plain water sometimes. There's a lot of what ifs, a lot of different strategies. And this is where it gets confusing. Like, hey, what if I wake up at 4:30 in the morning and I hit the road at 5 a.m. and I don't eat breakfast? Well, here's the thing. If you're training early in the morning, you are waking up dehydrated and malnourished. And it's very difficult. In fact, it's impossible to become hydrated and nourished again within, 4 to 5 hours, right? Your body needs time to replenish its stores. So if you have those early morning workouts, what I would recommend from a fluid perspective is have a little bit of fluid, as much as your stomach can handle before the activity that you do, but have electrolytes in it. Have some sodium, maybe also kind of a balanced electrolyte profile. So sodium, chloride, magnesium, potassium, calcium. Always include electrolytes with your morning water intake, because when you add electrolytes, the electrolytes kind of act like a sponge. So that will help absorb the water. So in the event that you just drink water by itself, you'll actually end up peeing a lot of that out. And that's not the goal of early morning hydration strategies, because you actually want to absorb that water. Okay. All right. Secondly, carbohydrates before a workout. They could be important and they could be necessary, but classic sport nutrition answer is it kind of depends. It depends on your goals. It depends on the time of day that you're doing it. It depends what you're doing in terms of the intensity and the duration of your workout. So a lot of times athletes say, "Oh, I need to pound some gels. I need to have a sport drink. I need to add, do whatever." Possibly, absolutely. I'm not discounting that, but it also depends on your training cycle. So if you're in base training versus a competition season, what you do beforehand might be a lot different, especially once you're in off season. So there are a lot of moving parts here. We know carbohydrates are extremely important, but it really depends on the training cycle, the physiological adaptations you're trying to do, and your goals for the session in terms of, if you consume carbohydrates beforehand, how many you actually should consume. Now, the next two kind of go hand in hand, protein and fat. Do you need to consume protein and fat before a workout or before a race? Maybe, right? And again, sorry to be so vague about these answers, but it really kind of comes down to that N of one. What does your digestive system allow? How do you handle protein? How do you handle fat? But more importantly, remember, protein and fat are longer to digest in your body. Okay. So you usually don't want a lot of those within an hour to an hour and a half before a workout. So if you don't have a lot of time before a workout, I wouldn't recommend consuming too many proteins, too many fats at all, right? Focus on carbohydrates if you're going to eat, if you're going to consume anything. Now, if you have a little bit longer, if you have like 2 or 3 hours before a workout, then absolutely have a little bit of protein, have a small amount of fat, because those nutrients are still very important to help not only satisfy your body's energy needs, but those will help you recover on the backside. And then lastly, the sodium. Should you include sodium in your pre-workout plan? Well, sorry, it depends, right? It absolutely does. If you're just going for a short workout, maybe 30, 45 minutes, you probably don't need any at all. Maybe you have a snack beforehand that actually, maybe the food that you have actually has some sodium in it. Fantastic. But what we see normally, if the workout is shorter in duration or lower intensity, you probably don't need a lot of sodium right before that workout. Now, if the workout is longer, and I'm thinking longer than an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours, and possibly it's outdoors in hotter environments or humid environments, then yes, absolutely, you need to include some sodium. Easiest way to do that is through a fluid, like you can add some in a smoothie if you want to do a traditional sport drink or a non-traditional sport drink. Absolutely. But what you're seeing in this pre-workout window is a lot of it will depend on not only the time of day that you're doing the workout, but also your training cycle and your individual needs and how your body assimilates calories that time of the day. Okay. I know personally I have a very sensitive stomach. I have to be very, very controlled in terms of what goes in my body before a training session. Okay. Chapter 2 on this is, what do you do during training? Well, that's a tricky one. Like I said before, if the workout is under 60 minutes, usually you don't need much except for maybe water and some electrolytes, right? Maybe. If it's longer than 60 minutes, we know you need to consume fluid. We know you need some sodium, some electrolytes in there, and maybe carbohydrates. And why do I say maybe? Well, I say maybe because there are two different nutrient timing strategies. Not many people know this, right? There's the first one is called glycogen maximization. And true to its name, that just means that you are feeding carbohydrates not aggressively, but frequently, right? You're trying to put in a lot of carbohydrates during that session because the glycogen maximization strategy is all centered around replacing carbohydrates that you're burning. Okay. The other strategy is called metabolic efficiency. Now, I created that because if you are supporting your body and trying to improve your body's ability to use fat for energy and preserve carbohydrates, there's actually a very different nutrient timing strategy that you should do. And that centers around being more periodized with your carbohydrates during a workout. So sometimes you're going to need more, sometimes you're going to need less. The glycogen maximization nutrient timing strategy is a proponent of more. The metabolic efficiency nutrient timing strategy is a proponent of assessing the situation. So maybe you do need carbohydrates, maybe you don't need carbohydrates, right? Also depends on the training cycle that you're in throughout the year and the physiological adaptations you want to see from your training. Okay, protein and fat during a workout, no, you don't need it. Now, there are some unless. Some kind of, there's a little bit of wiggle room here. If you are an ultra endurance athlete, so I'm thinking ultra runner, ultra cyclist, and you're doing like 24-hour events and you're training longer than like 8 hours a day, yes, you're going to need a little bit of protein and fat just because you need some calories. You need to stay fuller a little bit longer. So in those cases, yes, protein and fat do become important during a workout, but most endurance athletes do not need to bother with consuming any type of protein and fat during a workout. Now, sodium. Sodium during a workout, do you need it? Yeah, most of the time you do. But here's the thing, you don't know how much you need. In fact, research doesn't even tell us, like it gives us an idea. What we have is from real life examples of athletes and testing done, and the testing is sweat sodium concentration testing. Now, that's the amount of sodium that your body excretes in fluid or in sweat. So if you have that measured, fantastic. Then you can kind of set up exactly how much sodium you should have, and actually, in fact, how much fluid you should have if you have that measurement done. Now, if you don't have it measured, the range that exists is quite large. And I'm going to tell you this range so at least you have somewhere to start. If you don't know where to start with how much sodium you should consume during a workout, remember this. Athletes have been tested in terms of their sweat sodium concentration. And it has been found that there is a range between 300 milligrams all the way up to 2,000 milligrams. That's standard. There are some outliers on the low end and on the high end, but you can safely say somewhere between 300 and 2,000 milligrams of sodium you should replace per hour during your workout. And I know it's a huge range, right? I mean, that gives you a huge spread. And you're like, oh my gosh, where do I start? Here's my rule of thumb. If you have not had your sweat sodium concentration measured, start at the low end, start at 300 milligrams, because you can always go up from there, right? I'd rather have you go up in smaller increments than start high and come back. Because listen, we don't need a lot of sodium in our daily nutrition plan. And in fact, if you are following more of a metabolic efficiency, blood sugar optimization daily nutrition plan, you're not going to need a lot of sodium, most likely during your workouts. Okay. Now, what about afterwards? Well, afterwards gets a little tricky because remember, again, I presented the two different nutrient timing strategies, glycogen maximization and metabolic efficiency. So when we look at fluid after a workout, it doesn't matter, right? It matters. It doesn't matter in terms of the nutrient timing strategy because consuming fluids is the exact same protocol for both strategies. We need to replace our fluids. Check. Where these strategies differ is in the carbohydrate, protein, and fat intake after a workout. So if you're following a glycogen maximization nutrient timing strategy, obviously carbohydrates are king, and you almost want to overfeed your carbohydrates to try to fill up your carbohydrate gas tank afterwards. Now, if you're following the metabolic efficiency nutrient timing strategy, there's a time and place, but again, what I like to do is periodize the carbohydrate, protein, and fat in terms of the hand model that I teach, that 1-to-1 ratio, 2-to-1 ratio, 3-to-1 ratio, okay? So there are different ratios of carbohydrate to protein that I encourage depending on your training cycle if you are following the metabolic efficiency nutrient timing strategy, okay? So there are major differences that exist in carbohydrate, protein, and fat with those two different strategies. Now, the last nutrient, sodium. Should you have sodium after a workout? Yeah, you should, absolutely, because remember, sodium will act as a sponge to help you absorb the fluid. So it doesn't matter if you're just adding some salt to some type of drink, maybe a smoothie or something, or you're doing a traditional sport drink, or you're mixing in, my favorite is just with food. Have some salty foods or add a little bit of salt to the food that you eat after a workout. We know we need sodium. There's not a prescription for that. We just know we need at least a few hundred milligrams of sodium after the workout. Okay, that was your nutrient timing 101. I know it's a lot of information. I appreciate you listening to this, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of information in terms of one, knowing that there are two different nutrient timing systems that exist, and two, a few of the nuances that exist between two of them. And three, hopefully I've given you at least enough information where you can be dangerous and start implementing some of this, at least thinking of this. Now I've got a lot of great resources to kind of follow up with this nutrient timing, 201, 301, 401, so on and so forth. But again, my goal was just to expose this to you because listen, it's race season, right? It's time to take your nutrient timing strategies kind of up a notch, make it high priority. So if you do need some information, reach out to me. You can find my information below. And I thank you so much for watching this video.